And it's a real great pleasure. I know Iseult has a very, very busy life in teaching and lots and lots of research. And particularly at this time of term, it's a real dedication to come and give this talk tonight. We really wanted Iseult to come because of her great expertise in thinking about nanoparticles. We might hear a lot about this word nano in the modern world. But Iseult has done a lot of actual kind of research and really knows what these particles are used for, but more importantly, how they then prevalent in the environment and how we can manage them and use them safely and what the risks might be. And she's worked in Ireland, in Dublin, Sweden, and now in Birmingham, and has collaborations right across Europe and across the world, and really leads a lot of major European projects in this area. So it's a really great pleasure to have Iseult with us tonight, and I'll hand over to her for this talk. If you have questions, we'll take a good question and answer session at the end. If any come up into your mind, please just pop them in the chat during the talk or at the end, and then I'll pick them up and pose them to Iseult at the end of this talk. Thanks very much. I'll hand over to Iseult.
Thank you, Tom, for the lovely introduction. And I will just say, I do tend to get carried away and really enthusiastic when I'm presenting. So if I look like I have no intention of stopping after about 40 minutes, do just turn your camera back on or interrupt me, because yeah, I can get a bit carried away with my enthusiasm. So today I'm not actually going to talk much about nano. I'm going to talk more about microplastics, and then also, because we're heading into the festive season, I thought I'd also introduce a bit on glitter as well, which actually is a plastic, which is news to a lot of people. So micro is a size, as is nano, and they basically just mean that they're getting smaller and smaller, the particles. So micro is really the size range of 1 × 10⁻⁶ of a meter, so 6 orders of magnitude smaller than a meter. But typically when we're talking about microplastics as a pollutant, we're talking about anything of 5 millimeters and below. So things that we can visibly see, like the fragments here that have broken down from larger plastics, and all the way down then to the ones that are actually too tiny for us to see with our eye, and where we'd actually need a microscope or even an electron microscope to see them. So we're used to thinking about plastic pollution as being, the large visible pieces of plastic, but actually they are really only a small portion of the major problem. So while yes, we have all sorts of unfortunate and really undesirable impacts from the visible plastic pieces, and we're used to seeing some of these really distressing images of birds caught in the beer can holders and things. It's actually the bigger question that's emerging now is what happens as these these plastics break down in the environment. So as these plastic cups or plastic bags are lingering in the environment over decades and over even centuries, they are continuously being exposed to ultraviolet light, so from the light from the sun, and to sort of physical action from waves or from hitting against rocks and so on. So they do over time fragment and break down. And it's those broken down parts that are the ones that we're particularly interested in. So now we're starting to ask the question of what happens when these tiny particles that we can't really see get inside organisms. This organism that features, I can't give a presentation without sharing a Daphnia, because Daphnia are the water flea, and they're a super interesting species that I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about, working with, and exposing to various pollutants, some of which are nanomaterials and some of which are microplastics. So here you can actually see one of the reasons they're so interesting as a species is because they're transparent, which means we can image them, we can see what's actually happening. And here we're seeing individual microplastic particles that have got sort of stuck in their gut. So basically making the organisms feel full, even though they're not getting any nutrient or any calorific value from these particles. The other thing is we can do all sorts of fancy things where we can label the particles. So these are particles that have fluorescent dye associated with them. So we can also then look at how the dye moves and where it goes and things. So, but the real point is that we don't yet fully understand the consequences of this for the individual Daphnia and for the food chain overall, and then for the ecosystem, and then for us as humans. Daphnia are an important part of the food chain. So they eat the algae, so they eat the phytoplankton, and then they are zooplankton, and they're eaten then by fish and other organisms. They're also a filter feeder, which means they're exposed. They take the water in and they filter it basically. So they're exposed to everything that's in the water. So you might be thinking, why are we looking at an organism that's mainly in freshwater when actually we think about plastics as being a problem in the oceans? But that's a bit of a misnomer. So while we know an awful lot more about the problem of plastic pollution in the ocean, that isn't really the main problem at all. So yes, we're used to seeing these sorts of images of the seahorse with the cotton bud, for example, and we're used to hearing about the ocean gyres or the garbage patches where the large pieces of plastic due to ocean currents all end up in these plastic gyres or these plastic garbage patches. But if you think about it, the plastics are not coming from the sea. They're not, it's not only shipping and things like that that is causing microplastics or plastics. They're all coming from human activity. And where is the human activity concentrated? On land, of course. So all of plastic ends up in the ocean is actually coming from where the human populations are. And how is it getting into the oceans? In large part, it's transported through our rivers. So we're increasingly understanding that there are a wide range of microplastic sources, but that many of those are actually all converging in our wastewater treatment plants, and that the rivers, our freshwaters, are actually conduits of plastics and microplastics to the oceans. So if we really want to tackle some of these problems, understanding how they're accumulating and moving and collecting in the freshwater in our rivers is much easier challenge than trying to gather them back up again once they've gone out into the oceans. So the other point I just want to make here is that we can distinguish between two main types of microplastics. And this is really important because a lot of the things you're hearing about in the news at the moment about single-use plastics really only apply to the primary microplastics, or to the ones that are intentionally produced. So at the moment, the focus is really on reducing plastics that we use only once, rather than ones that are, rather than focusing on longer term issues. So the primary microplastics are, for example, the microbeads that used to be in cosmetics, or it used to be in toothpastes and things. So they've started to phase those out. So, and now I guess one of the major sources currently is, for example, 3D printing. So as we move toward more and more towards 3D printing, they're producing particles that are coming into the environment. And the plastic pellets are the nurdles. This is how, most plastics start off their life as nurdles, and then they get molded or shaped into various other things. So a small portion of these directly reaches the environment, but actually the vast majority of plastics come from secondary microplastics. So they're coming from the degradation of other things, or what we call anthropogenic, because they were unintentional side products. So we can think about things like the emissions from traffic. So this is tires, for example, are made from rubber, and rubber has traditionally been exempt from regulation, but we're now starting to understand that this very processed rubber that's in tires is actually producing wear particles that we're then inhaling. And also the paint that's used on the roads for the white and yellow lines, they're actually thermoplastics. So they're plastics that have are resistant to high temperatures. So again, the abrasion of the tires on those paints also starts to produce particles. And textiles are an important one, and I'll come back to those in a little bit. Every time we wash our clothes, and particularly our clothes that contain artificial fibers, so fleeces and things like that, produce a large amount of microplastic fibers. And then, all sorts of other things that get fragmented. So all of those, or most of those, end up going down the drain from the washing machine or from our personal care products or so on. And then they get processed through the wastewater treatment plant. Some of them end up in the sludge, which can then get respread back on agricultural soil. Some of them get through the wastewater treatment, because the wastewater treatment plants were not designed, the current processes used for wastewater treatment were not generally designed with microplastics, and particularly with even smaller ones with nanoplastics in mind. So large numbers are actually getting through and are still in the effluent when the effluent is released back into the water systems. So it turns out then that rivers really are the leading sources of plastic pollution. And about 10 rivers were identified a few years ago as being the main sources of plastic. And what you notice about those is that they're all in highly populated areas. So in a sense, it makes sense that, you know, the higher the population density, the more plastic that would be generated as a pollutant. They're also in areas that traditionally have less well-developed waste infrastructure. So, and maybe less regulated or less managed waste. But of course, this is still only a part of the issue. And what's hidden in that picture is that actually, until very recently, most of the plastic waste from the developed world, so from the UK, the US, Europe, and so on, were being sent to China and to Malaysia and to other countries to be dealt with. So while they were not the major producers necessarily of the plastic, the waste ended up there. And that's why we need to think more globally in terms of, you know, where the plastic is produced, where the plastic is disposed of, and you know, and that plastic cycle in a sense. So just to highlight this was a report from Greenpeace that came out earlier this year, looking at sort of doing some investigative journalism really to understand the truth behind the what happens to the UK's plastic waste and whether it really genuinely is recycled or not. And it turns out not is the appropriate word, that a large part of it was being our plastic waste that was intended for recycling got shipped to Turkey, and there it just got incinerated, often illegally at the side of the road. So really our statistics that say that we look good in terms of how much plastic we recycle are really not true. And a couple of colleagues and myself wrote a little piece about it at the time, and in parallel with that Greenpeace report coming out, there was also a report from Interpol about the increasing crime associated with plastic and with plastic waste. So, you know, you wouldn't really have thought of plastic as being up there with, you know, with drug trafficking and people trafficking, but from the Interpol point of view, they are all interlinked, and it's the same sort of gangs or groups that would be involved in all of those networks of activity. So plastic crime is also something that we'll be hearing more about, I think, in the future. So it's also increasingly being understood that microplastics are everywhere. And I think we can caveat that by saying that actually plastics are everywhere. So there's hidden plastics in all sorts of things that you would never have known were plastic. And then as a consequence of that, there is, you know, as they're releasing or they're being, you know, the products that contain plastic that we didn't know about are undergoing wear and tear. They're also releasing microplastics. So there was a study from a group in Canada at McGill University, where they looked at some of the sort of the pyramid-shaped tea bags, some of the fancier tea bags. And most of those had plastic in them as part of the mesh that was holding the tea leaves in place. And they did some studies to look at the number of plastics coming out and the types of plastics. And they have said, you know, from anywhere up to 11.6 billion microplastics and 3.1 billion nanoplastics released into a single cup of tea. So that's quite a lot to be taking in. Now, remember that just because it goes in, you know, when you consume something, just because it goes into your stomach, doesn't necessarily mean it will pass from your stomach into the bloodstream, for example, the way the nutrients and the good things we want will. So a lot of it just gets passed straight out in your when you go to the toilet. But that's still to say, you know, if even a small proportion of those 3.1 billion nanoplastics went into your, you know, passed into your bloodstream and circulated in your body, that yeah, we'd want to know about that, and we want to know what the consequences of that are. Another really interesting study, and I think this was also one that puts things sort of in perspective of, and again coming from marine pollution. So this was from Ted Henry up at Heriot-Watt University, where they were looking at mussels, who are, again, like the Daphnia, they're sort of they filter the water, so everything that's in the water they're also exposed to. And they found, again, you know, that there were quite a number of microplastics in the mussels. So if we were eating these, then that there's some risk of exposure from the ingestion of mussels. But they wanted to put it in a perspective and sort of see, well, how does that exposure compare to, you know, some other daily household exposures? So what they did was really quite elegant. Was they took basically a petri dish, which is just a small plastic dish, and they put it on the table in, you know, a couple of their own houses, essentially. So and they timed it over a 20-minute period, which is about the time that it would take to eat a typical meal. And what they found was that at the end of that typical 20-minute meal, the equivalent of 114 plastic fibers had fallen onto onto that dish that was the equivalent of a dinner plate. So they found that the amount of plastics they were eating just from their indoor air was orders of magnitude higher than what they would have consumed through eating the mussels. So it sort of puts the risk into proportion, and, you know, that we shouldn't get overly focused, for example, on you know, the risk of eating or consuming contaminated food when we're inhaling it all the time, unwittingly or unknowingly. So this is a figure from a paper that we have in press, so it's not actually out yet, but I thought it's a nice figure that sort of summarizes quite a lot of information. So where are microplastics coming from? So I mentioned already that indoor is a problem. So there's lots of potential sources of microplastics in our houses. So, you know, any sort of rugs, carpets, soft furnishings, our clothing, all sorts of things. And then we can think about whether we're inhaling them, if they stay in the air, or if we're ingesting them. So, and of course, for children and toddlers, there are particular risks of exposure. Again, because lots of children's toys are made from plastic. And yeah, that they could be putting them in their mouth while they're teething, for example. And then outdoor, we also have similarly quite a range of sources. So yeah, coming from all sorts of things like repurposed tires that might be then used in playgrounds. I mentioned already the paint on roads, and you can see that wears away. So that's shedding over time of small pieces of thermoplastic. And then, of course, sort of the broader environmental ones. So releases to the atmosphere, releases from industry, from runoff from roads, all sorts of things. So there's really a very broad range of sources of microplastics. And then in the paper that we were working on, we were trying to sort of put together sort of the information that's available currently from different studies in terms of the typical concentrations of different types of plastics. There's also, of course, been reports that there are microplastics coming out from your bottled water, from tap water, from salt, and all sorts of things. So we really are being exposed to quite large amounts of these particles. But of course, we're also being exposed to quite large amounts of other kinds of particles. So we know, for example, that living in cities, and living near to busy roads exposes us to large amounts of what we call PM10 and PM2.5. So particulate matter coming from combustion, from exhausts and things. So we know we're exposed to particles, and we know we've been exposed to particles ever since we invented fire. So there are, we have a lot of innate processes that help us deal with all of these plastic particles. But one of the questions that's now being asked, if if there's a risk that with all of these cumulative exposures to different sources of particles, if there's a risk that some of our mechanisms for protecting us will be overwhelmed or overcome. So whether there's new risks arising because we're exposed to increasingly large numbers of particles. So a lot of the research that we're doing at Birmingham is really trying to get a handle on some of the questions related to the health impacts of microplastics, both for humans and for the environment, but also trying to get a much more robust understanding of the concentrations and exposures of microplastics. So what are we actually being exposed to in these different environments? Because from this review that we did, there were huge variabilities in what people are reporting. And those huge variabilities come from the fact that how you do your sampling matters, where you do your sampling matters, when you do the sampling matters. And therefore, we're trying to develop a set of methods that allow us to compare very different locations and very different types of plastics. So one of the pieces of work we were doing was actually developing methods that we could detect and quantify plastic. So with fibers, it's relatively easy to see them, but with fragments and other particles, they can look very similar to some of the particles in naturally occurring in soil, for example. So we needed to develop methods that allow us to really, with confidence, say when something is a plastic versus when it's organic matter or clay particle or thing. So that was one piece of work we did using a dye that binds to the microplastics. And we did a lot of work to really make sure that how long we incubated the particle with the dye and the thresholds we used to make sure that we weren't accidentally detecting things that shouldn't be microplastics, and that we weren't over-reporting, for example, the fragments. We've also then applied our methods to real samples. So we did a citizen science study looking at microplastic hotspots on the south coast of the UK. And there we found, quite interestingly, that some of the highest concentrations of microplastics were found in areas of quite low population. So real evidence of the plastics moving, again, with currents a little bit, and showing that where the plastic is where the microplastics are generated and released is not necessarily where they will have effects on the ecosystems because of this movement of particles. So again, we really need to understand and take responsibility globally for the fact that we might be emitting something, but it might then accumulate somewhere else and cause quite severe consequences for others elsewhere. And this is all part of a project that we're leading called the 100 Plastic Rivers, which is really aiming to use the methods that we've developed and the harmonized protocol that we developed to collect samples from our colleagues across the world. And if everybody measures it exactly the same way, uses the same filter, the same cutoff size in our filter, so we're all collecting the same sizes, so 63 microns and above, and then all the samples get sent back to Birmingham, where we use the same microscopes, the same protocol, and the same well-trained researchers to do then the extraction and the counting of the microplastics. And then their categorization by shape. So whether they're fragments, whether they're fibers, whether they're fused, whether they're sort of spherical or so on. So what kind of materials they are. Ideally, we would love also to do some characterization of them in terms of what types of plastic, but that is a very slow, painstaking and robust, painstaking and time-consuming approach to do it properly. So at the minute, we're sort of taking some snapshots of those rather than really thoroughly characterizing everything. But really the goal is to have this first global database of microplastic concentrations sampled, isolated and detected using our consistent methodology. So a summary of this part before I then move into some of the other things that we're doing. So there is quite a bit of knowledge on the environmental levels of microplastics, but it's hugely varying because of disparity in sampling methods, because of disparity of the sizes that are captured, and then because there is still some method development needed. But we are at a point now where we can begin to detect sort of hot spots of accumulation. And the thing we're working now on is sort of, can we also determine these hot moments? So a hot spot is where there's a high concentration at one location, but a hot moment is, for example, you know, if there's release from a wastewater treatment plant, are we seeing that? If there's changes, you know, over the day, for example, because of releases of effluent, if there's changes over the seasons, we're not seeing that through our current method of just taking a one snapshot. And we also need additional lab and field experiments, and also the sort of the in-between. So I didn't mention it yet, but we have at Birmingham these mesocosm facilities, are recirculating streams, and we're using those to really begin to understand the degradation and the environmental distribution of microplastics in the environment. So then just to say, there is, one of the recent developments that I think is really, sorry, go away. No, go, sorry. So there is a all-party parliamentary group on microplastics, which has made a recommendation just now to include microfiber filters in all new domestic and commercial washing machines from 2025. So that is a really, really positive development. And it means that all of those ones that are coming, as I said, from washing will shortly be a thing of the past. So they've also recommended a Minister for Plastics Pollution, which would have a clear remit for control and prevention of plastics. So that's another fantastic development. So then I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about microplastic or glitter, and to sort of, as we come into the festive season, to be aware of all of the role of microplastics in our Christmas decorations. So pretty much everything we think about as Christmassy is associated with plastic and with glitter. So tinsel, Christmas jumpers, Christmas crackers, all of those are major sources of microplastics. And it's also interesting, there's just a couple of reports here from last Christmas where there was a really strong push to move away from plastics, that many of the major supermarkets were reducing the use of glitter in their packaging materials. So there is quite a move and quite an understanding of that, but of course there's still a lot of legacy microplastics around. So what is glitter? For many of us, it's quite a surprise to find that it is actually a plastic. So in the earliest days, it was actually extracted from, for example, from malachite, which is a copper carbonate hydroxide mineral. So, and you can see here the sparkles in it. Also, in ancient civilizations, people use mica, which is again sort of a material that has a natural inherent sparkle to it. And it's sort of still used in some cosmetics and things. But the first use of plastic glitter came in about 1934, when we had the first stretched polyethylene phthalate, so PET. And ever since then, it's sort of been used. So basically, it's still made from sheets of PET with reflective materials deposited onto the surface. So aluminium, titanium, iron oxide, etc. So yeah, so PET is the major ingredient in glitter. So how do we know that and how do we characterize it? So one of the methods that we've been developing at the University of Birmingham and really trying to push our understanding of what plastics are present in the environment is this quite complex setup called TGI or GCMS, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically it takes the sample and first it heats it very high to see at what temperature it pyrolyzes. So pyrolysis is burning in the absence of oxygen. Then we take the output from that and we look at it in the IOR, which tells us about the chemistry, and then we pass it through into the GC, which will then give us the individual chemistries of the components, so the peaks that we look at and we get a spectra. So the first part then is the thermal gravimetric analysis. So this is basically a balance essentially. So we heat the sample very slowly and we see what comes off. And as I said, under nitrogen rather than in our normal fire, we would have oxygen. So we put our particles in and we put our environmental sample in, which usually contains our microplastics, and then we do the pyrolysis. And this gives us a typical what we call a thermogram. So the first bit will have just a little bit of water, then we start to get the main loss event which gives us the inflection point, tells us generally what type of material it is, because each plastic will have a different pyrolysis temperature. And then the very last bit is just the remaining matter. So from this pyrolysis event, we can see the inflection point is 448 and that 77% of the initial mass was lost. So from our library of those sort of spectra thermograms, we can say what material it is with pretty high confidence. Then we pass that the gas that's come off that into our IR spectrometer, and this then gives us a very specific spectra for each of the different types of surface groups. So again, we have built up a library of different spectra, which we can use then. So if we do that when we know what the material is, and then we can use that those spectra to identify our unknown plastics. And finally, then the last part is the gas chromatography mass spectrometry. So again, this one gives us a very, very unique fingerprint of the mass of every single thing that has come off that. This one really does require quite some expert knowledge of the chemistry and the physics, and we use the masses of each of the individual pieces. And this is what it looks like for glitter again, our PET glitter particle. And you can see all sorts of peaks of different heights and different intensities. And we can begin to map out what each of those peaks are and where they come based on their chemical structure and therefore their mass. And in this case, we have a few telltale peaks. So we know that a few are very typical of the fingerprint essentially of glitter. So and there's a link to the paper tells us more about that. So the question then is glitter bad? So if we're talking about it in the context of microplastics, and we're talking about microplastics as being highly persistent in the environment and potentially causing all sorts of problems to organisms and to us as humans when we inhale them, the short answer is that yes, glitter is bad in that it's an intentionally produced microplastic that is really only for decorative purposes. It doesn't actually have a real function. Also, its small size means that it can get into organisms and can cause all sorts of physical and chemical harm to the organisms. And we know we have a long history of studying the impacts of particles. So we know in large part that it's the particle form rather than the fact that it's a plastic that might be the big challenge from a health effect. So from the environmental side, it's the fact that it's persistent, and from the health side, it's most probably because of its particulate nature that it's harmful or bad for us. So what then about eco glitters? So very recently, there's been quite a large push towards using alternatives to PET in glitter. So, and these would typically use things like biodegradable cellulose polymers or the more old-fashioned mica. So again, lots of the cosmetic ones use mica. But the thing we have to note is that biodegradable is a very specific term from a regulatory point of view. It doesn't mean we put it out in our compost heap in the garden and it'll just disappear naturally. It doesn't mean that it's a banana skin, for example. What biodegradable means is that it will degrade under a very specific set of conditions, which are used in a test to determine does something meet the requirements to be considered biodegradable or not. It doesn't mean that if it ends up, if it goes down the wastewater treatment system and is released in the effluent, it doesn't mean that it will biodegrade and not be a problem at all. As I said, the health effects from the particles actually might be more of an issue than the fact that they're plastic. So the last thing I'm going to show you is a slide from other colleagues. This was at the Angela Ruskin University. And they did a study, it came out just last year, where they actually compared in aquatic mesocosms the impact of no glitter added versus conventional glitter particles, so the PET particles. And then they looked at some of these alternative particle types. So they looked at modified regenerated cellulose or mica, or then a synthetic mica. And they looked at a few different endpoints. So they looked at a common duckweed, which is basically a plant that grows in fresh water. They looked at the chlorophyll levels, which tell us about how healthy the ecosystem is overall, because generally we want good levels of chlorophyll in the water. Of course, we don't want it to go too high, because when we get too high, that means we've got algal blooms, for example, and then you see that green glow coming off the water. So you don't want that. But they also then looked at the impacts on mud snails. So again, what's in the water versus what's in the sediment. And again, they looked at the impacts from the standard PET. They found some decreases in root length and some decreases in the chlorophyll concentrations. With the modified regenerated cellulose, they actually found, again, decreases in root length, decreases in the water chlorophyll, and they found an increase in invasive snail species. So this was a problem in that it actually promoted or gave an advantage, I guess, to an invasive species, which is also something that we don't necessarily want for our ecosystems. And the mica then was quite similar just to the PET, reduced root length and reduced water chlorophyll. And the synthetic mica also had in this case, it actually increased the chlorophyll or increased the sediment chlorophyll. So caused, for example, some bacteria in the sediment to dominate. So, and that, so those sorts of results. So that's just one study, and it's a first look at some of these alternative biodegradable glitters, but it's just to make the point that they may not be as benign as they're being advertised as. So yes, they might reduce the intentionally added plastics, but by being particulate themselves, they might also then induce some other impacts. So lastly, then, just to say that right now there is a survey open, or a consultation open by the government on proposals to ban commonly littered single-use plastic items. It's open between now and the 12th of February, and it is open for everyone. You don't have to be an expert, you can just be a concerned citizen. So yeah, it would be well worth to have a look at it and to give your opinion, have your say. You are the people who will be dealing with the consequences of decisions made now for the rest of your lives. So please do get involved and have your say. And then just the summary from this last piece is that there are multiple sources and types of plastics with a very complex range of additives. And as we've seen, that some of the in principle biodegradable plastics might actually be worse than or as bad or worse than some of the traditional plastics. And then I didn't have time to talk too much about it, but the toxicity of microplastics, and I think the last study showed it a little bit, but the toxicity of microplastics to ecosystems and humans is poorly understood. And we need to distinguish between the effects that come from the physical effects, so from it being the plastic itself. Some of the effects are likely from additives that are transported with the microplastics. So as we make plastics and as we make glitter and all sorts of things, there's all sorts of additives associated with those microplastics, and they can then be released into organisms. And then we also have ones in the environment will also pick up all sorts of other chemicals or pollutants that are there. So we also then have this third potential route of toxicity where microplastics are impacting on their surroundings. So, and all of those can then be released into organisms. So that's it. That was a quick whistle-stop tour of some of the research that we are doing and others are doing. So it's such a fascinating and fast-moving area that I hope I gave you a bit of a flavour of, and I hope I didn't run too badly over time. Oh, I didn't. For me, at least, I didn't run too badly over time. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to answering any of your questions. And I'm going to kill my husband when I'm finished.
The warning. Thanks so much, Iseult. Can you hear me okay? Just checking.
Yes, yes, perfectly.
Good. Yeah, no, that was excellent. So thanks. And please do post any questions that you might have for Iseult in the chat. So we already have one coming in, which was, could you, what was the machine called that was used to identify the microplastics, the one being developed at the university?
Yes, yeah. So it was, yeah, so the abbreviation is TGA for thermogravimetric analysis, thermogravimetric assessment. Then we had FTIR, which is Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. And then finally GCMS, so gas chromatography mass spectroscopy. So we kind of abbreviated as TGIR GCMS. So quite a mouthful, but yeah, it's so a lot of other researchers are using something quite similar where they're sort of just using they call it a pyrolysis GCMS. So they skip the middle bit with the FTIR. So yeah, a lot of researchers are developing methods to and libraries of this sort of information of the mass specs and the chemical signatures, so that we can increasingly be able to understand and characterize unknown plastics in the environment.
Brilliant, thanks. Question from Lynn. Is it possible to filter out microplastics from the water? And I guess what's the sort of size constraints? What is being dealt with at the moment, maybe, and what can be dealt with?
Yeah. So in most of the literature, it seems that the trade-off between how tight the mesh is in the filter and the size of the particle. So obviously, the bigger the mesh you have, the more you'll miss. So the smaller particles will all go through. But if you have the mesh too small, then you'll also get blockage, and it'll take really long times to filter. So when we were developing our method for the 100 Plastic Rivers project, we made the decision that we wanted people to filter 50 litres of water, to have a common amount to do that. And we didn't want it to take too long. So we chose a mesh size that was, that basically we captured things 63 micron and above. So that's, I mean, given that microplastics are from 5 millimeters down, we're capturing sort of definitely the larger end, but we know we're missing all of the ones that are sort of at the sizes that start to become really important for for biology, so, and for human health. So when we compare that, for example, to the kinds of particles that air pollution people are generally interested in, they're interested in the PM10, which is 10 microns, and the PM2.5, which is 2.5 microns, and the ultrafines, which are 100 nanometers. So the ones that are causing health are definitely below, are causing health problems, are definitely below what we're as standard collecting through our general methods. And that is a bit of a trade-off, we know that, but at the same time, if we don't then have the methods to characterize the ones at the smaller sizes anyway, and we certainly can't yet, count them very routinely, there isn't a whole lot of point in collecting them at the moment. So there's sort of two approaches. There's the top down, trying to understand what's there, and then the bottom up, where we are designing experiments where we're intentionally adding the smaller ones, but adding them in a way that we know we can track them. So adding them, say, with a fluorescent tag on them, or adding them with an enriched radioisotope that we can track, or or with a metal core that we can detect more easily. So, and we know that those two approaches are going to eventually merge to a point where we will have the detection methods to be able to look at the smaller particles, and then we'll also then be able to develop pump systems and things to push the water through more effectively, so that we can, or maybe do a first filtration step where we pass them through the 63 micron to remove the bigger ones, and then take that filtrate and refilter it through a much smaller mesh. So, for example, through a 0.2 micron filter, for example, to really start to get the smaller end of things. But the volumes, I mean, it would be very difficult to filter 50 liters of water through the tiny filters. But if we first passed it through the big filter, and then take the filtrate and start to pass that through, it should get easier. So an awful lot more work to be done, but at least we're beginning to get to where we need to be.
I guess just one for me, following up from that, just given the sort of pervasiveness of these particles in the system, like, what are the sort of chances of kind of removing them, or not even remove, but it seems like such a vast problem. Where starts, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, so I think, to be honest, I think the washing machine filters is a really good first step, because some of them we know, like, I mean, fibers and things, because they're long, the chances of them just lining up exactly to fit through the mesh are quite small. So, they're going to be, and because of the way the washing works with tumbling and things, they're going to be sort of in a network anyway. And we can see that, when you've ever emptied the filter on your tumble dryer, for example, you see that bit. Yeah. So, I think we can remove certainly a large amount at source. The very tiny ones, yes, will probably still go through. But if we're removing the larger ones, that's still taking a lot of the problem out of the system. And I think conceptually it's worth comparing it to the issues with air pollution. So, previously, when we were thinking about smog and, really visible air pollution, that again was the larger particles. And as they've been removed, yes, we now can make a connection and say, well, okay, it's actually the really small ones that are the ones that are linked to, for example, lung problems and cardiovascular problems. But by having removed all of those large ones, we're getting rid of a lot of the sort of the lower level exposures and links. And now we can really then hone in on the really problematic ones. So I think personally that microplastics research is sort of at the beginning of that problem and that process that air pollution went through over the last 40 years or so.
Yeah.
But I think we'll go much faster because we can learn from what the microplastic or what the air pollution people have done, and we can learn from all of the work that has been done with engineered or intentionally produced nanomaterials. So I think there's an awful lot of really useful existing research that can be built on to move the microplastic question very quickly.
Oh, excellent. Cool. And then really good questions, Jane. Once you've removed them from whichever part of the system, then what do you do with them? How do you dispose of them? You know?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And hopefully the idea would be that we will, once you've removed them, and if you know what they are, so say with the filters for the washing machine, we know the sorts of plastics that are there. So hopefully the idea would be over time that they could then be, there could be collection points, and they could then be recycled back into new clothes, for example, or into new products. So the challenge, one of the big challenges, I think, is really going to be consumer driven, I think, in large part, and an insistence that we don't want what's called virgin plastic. We don't want to continue with new plastic all the time. That even if the products don't look as shiny or don't look as beautiful, that we want to know that there's at least some 50% of the plastic in our products is recycled plastic. So I think a lot of that push will come from consumers and from ordinary individuals saying, we don't want new plastic in everything. We want recycled plastic.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Are there any more questions for Iseult? I think, yeah, it's a fascinating and sort of mind-boggling kind of talk. But one thing I've taken away is just the thought about kind of eco glitters, and obviously you question how eco they are, but at least it's got me thinking about the products that we're going to be pushing around at Christmas, and they're so easy to buy and kind of use sort of slightly careless way. One more question.
Yeah.
So we got from Madeline. So it says, I know that microplastics can cause endocrine disruptions in fish, but is there a chance of seeing this issue in larger organisms via bioaccumulation, or is this unlikely? So
yes, absolutely. And I guess we've seen increasingly, again, companies advertising their plastics as being BPA free. So BPA, again, is one of those chemicals that has been linked. It's a plasticizer, so it's added intentionally to the plastics to change how they can be molded and shaped. And it is definitely an endocrine disruptor. So it's not usually the plastics themselves, it's this fact that they have all these additives in there. Again, the ones from indoor air pollution, for example, the ones from our from our sofas and our carpets and things, they also have flame retardants in there, because we need the flame retardants in the products. But the problem is that they're not chemically bound, so they then get released as well with the plastics. So I think in large part it's the additives that are a lot of the problems from the health point of view. So yes, there is definitely scope for endocrine disruption even in humans being exposed to these. So and I think when you start to look at some of the studies that have shown the prevalence of BPA and phthalates and other things in serum of children all over the world, it is quite scary that and I think many of these are not as fully regulated as they could be, because often they're in at relatively low concentrations in the product overall, because regulation always works on the mass. So if you have only a tiny amount of something in a huge piece of furniture, the mass of the chemical is going to be negligible compared to the mass of the piece of furniture. So there are definitely some loopholes in how we regulate chemicals that hopefully over time and as we gain more knowledge will begin to be closed a bit, and that it will not only just be on the mass of the chemical in the product, but actually looking at the why are additives there, and do they really need to be there? Are there safer alternatives to those additives, and so on?
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Iseult. I say it's a brilliant kind of expanding kind of talk and thinking about, you know, our kind of modern environment, like from the local to our washing machines and tumble dryers, right the way through to kind of global rivers. It's really kind of a fascinating talk. So just to flag